This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Tokyo was a city that never slept, where the pulse of life beat through neon-lit streets and the relentless hum of activity filled the air like an invisible current. It was a city of contradictions. Beneath its towering skyscrapers and bustling train stations lay quiet alleyways, dark corners where the pulse of the city seemed to fade into nothingness. It was in these shadows, hidden in plain sight, that a different Tokyo existed, one that few dared to acknowledge, even fewer spoke of. It was a Tokyo of isolation, of forgotten people, of young souls swallowed by the enormity of the world around them. Among the glittering lights and crowded streets, in a small, crumbling apartment complex tucked away in the depths of Shibuya, lived 16-year-old Ayumi Takahashi. Her world was one of monotony and silence. The apartment complex was a maze of narrow hallways and thin walls, where every sound seemed amplified. The neighbors came and went, their faces fleeting glimpses in the corridors, their voices whispers through the paper-thin walls. Finally, Ayumi's apartment was no different, just another small unit squeezed between others, like a forgotten box in the corner of a crowded warehouse. The building itself seemed alive, creaking and groaning at night as if it were a body suffering the weight of years, filled with people who no longer mattered. The lights flickered at odd hours, and the elevator hummed with a strange, mechanical rhythm that often made Ayumi uneasy. Yet, she had grown used to it, to the hollow silence that enveloped her every time she stepped inside. There was a rhythm to the place, an unsettling rhythm that made her feel like an outsider in a place she was supposed to call home. Ayumi had always been the quiet girl, the one who sat at the back of the classroom, whose name was rarely called, and whose presence seemed to fade into the background. At school, she was a ghost, neither hated nor loved, just ignored. She moved through her days with a detached numbness, the world around her a blur of faces and voices that she could never quite reach. Her classmates never spoke to her unless they had to. When they did, it was with the dull politeness that people reserve for those they consider invisible. And Ayumi didn't mind. In fact, she preferred it that way. Being unseen, being unheard, allowed her to observe, a silent watcher in a world that felt too loud, too overwhelmed. Her mother, a single woman working long hours at a marketing firm, barely noticed Ayumi's existence. The few words they exchanged were typically brief and transactional, a quick reminder to do the laundry or take out the trash. Her mother's face was always tired, always weary, her eyes empty of any warmth. There were no conversations about school, no talks about dreams or aspirations. It was as if Ayumi was just another thing to be managed in the endless list of tasks her mother had to deal with. At night, Ayumi would retreat to her room, the door locked behind her, her only refuge from the world outside. The room was small, cluttered with the remnants of a life lived in the margins, old books, worn-out clothes, an old television that flickered occasionally with static. The walls were bare, save for a few faded posters of pop idols she had long since stopped caring about. But it wasn't the room that mattered. It was the silence. The silence was the only thing that had ever felt real to Ayumi. It was where the whispers began, where the strange thoughts crept into her mind. The whispers were never loud, never demanding. They were soft at first, like a breeze just beyond hearing, brushing against the edges of her consciousness. They didn't speak in words, but in feelings. Subtle nudges, suggestions that something was wrong, that the world around her wasn't as it seemed. Sometimes they felt comforting, like a voice that understood her isolation. Other times they were darker, urging her to seek out something more, something beyond the numbness that had defined her existence. She didn't know where the whispers came from or why they had started, but she couldn't deny that they were always there, lurking in the spaces between her thoughts. At night, as the city pulsed outside her window, Ayumi would stare at the glowing lights of Tokyo, the skyline stretching endlessly before her. It was beautiful in its own way, all those lights twinkling like stars, but it also felt cold, like a city that had forgotten how to care. The bustling streets below seemed so far away, so distant, like something she would never be a part of. And yet, deep down, She knew that Tokyo, with its gleaming towers and endless traffic, held something for her. Something that no one else had ever given her. It was on one of these nights, with the city alive and indifferent outside her window, that Aumi first heard the voice clearly. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a thought, an urge, a demand. You are stronger than them. You can take control. She hadn't been able to explain it to herself. The voice wasn't like anything she had experienced before. It wasn't just a fleeting thought or a passing idea. It felt like something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. In that moment, as the lights of Tokyo blinked like stars in the distance, Aumi realized that she had been waiting too, waiting for something to break, waiting for a spark that would ignite the darkness within her. But it wasn't a dream, nor was it a nightmare. It was a truth, one that was too heavy for her to ignore. Aumi had always felt like an outsider, like a piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. But now, as the voice echoed in her mind, she felt something else. Power. A strange, intoxicating sense of power that made her heart race. It told her that the city, with all its noise and people, was merely a backdrop to a much darker story. Her story. Aumi had always been invisible, a mere shadow passing through the lives of those around her. But that night, as the voice grew louder, she understood that she wasn't meant to be forgotten anymore. She was meant to be seen, meant to be remembered. The city, with all its endless lights and sprawling streets, had no idea what was coming. But Aumi knew. She could feel it. Feel the shift deep within her, the stirring of something she couldn't name, but something that had always been there, waiting. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a promise. And in the heart of Tokyo, in the silence of her apartment, Aumi Takahashi took the first step into a world that would soon tremble under the weight of her existence. Aumi Takahashi had never known true warmth. Her childhood was an endless gray, a blur of faces, sounds, and memories that faded like smoke the moment she tried to grasp them. Born into a world of emotional neglect, she grew up in an apartment complex that stood like a silent witness to the disintegration of a family. Tokyo, with all its sprawling lights and towering buildings, seemed a distant dream to Aumi. She had never been able to touch the world outside her small, crumbling apartment, an apartment that, in her mind, her mother was a stranger to her, a figure who existed more as a shadow than a parent. She worked tirelessly, her days filled with the grind of the corporate world, returning home late at night with eyes dull and hollow from exhaustion. Aumi never knew when her mother would come home, and it was rare for them to share any meaningful interaction. She had long since stopped trying to get her attention, understanding that her mother's love was an empty promise, an ideal that was never going to be fulfilled. The silence between them was deafening, but it was the only language they both knew. In the rare moments when her mother was home, Aumi would watch her as she sat in front of the television, a glass of wine in her hand, lost in her own world. There was no warmth in her gaze, no comfort in her touch. Ayumi's world became a mirror of her mother's disconnection, empty, cold, and devoid of any meaningful connection. Her father, on the other hand, had been a fleeting presence in her life. His addiction to alcohol had long since consumed him, and his absences were so frequent that Aumi barely remembered what it was like to have a father who cared. When he was home, he was often too drunk to recognize his own daughter, let alone provide any guidance or affection. His outbursts, violent, loud, and erratic, had she learned to stay out of his way, to retreat into her own corner of the apartment whenever he was there. His rare moments of clarity were even more disturbing than his drunken rages, as if the man who once had the potential to be a father had completely vanished, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who could never protect her. Aumi learned early on to rely on herself. The apartment, small and cluttered, became her sanctuary, her only refuge from the chaos outside. She would lock her bedroom door at night, pressing her ear against the thin walls, hearing the muffled voices of her neighbors, the distant sounds of Tokyo's heartbeat. There was something oddly comforting about the noise, a reminder that the world continued to turn, even if she felt as though she were stuck in place. It was in her room, that Ayumi began to discover a new world, a world not bound by the rules of society or family. It was in the silence, in the solitude, that her mind wandered to darker places. The whispers began when Ayumi was 10. At first they were faint, like the rustling of leaves in a forgotten corner of her mind. She thought she was imagining them, a product of her loneliness and the disconnect she felt from everyone around her. But as time went on, the whispers grew clearer, more insistent. They didn't speak in words at first, but in feelings. Ayumi couldn't explain it, but she felt it deep in her bones. It was as if something or someone was watching her, waiting for her to realize her potential. The more she listened, the louder the voice became. It told her she was different, that she had been born into a world that didn't understand her, a world that had treated her as insignificant. But she wasn't insignificant. She was special, chosen, and the voice promised her that she could take control, that she could carve out her own place in a world that had always ignored her. At school, Ayumi was a ghost. She moved through the halls unnoticed, a blank face among the sea of students who lived their lives in loud colors. She never fit in, never belonged to any of the groups that existed in the rigid social hierarchy of high school. The other students saw her as nothing more than a passing shadow. They didn't laugh at her, but they didn't acknowledge her either. She was the quiet girl, the one who never raised her hand in class, the one whose face never appeared in the yearbook photos. But Ayumi didn't care. She had learned long ago that being invisible was both a curse and a blessing. It allowed her to observe, to watch the world unfold without being touched by it. In the silence, the whispers grew stronger, filling the empty spaces that her mind had once feared. They began to shape her thoughts, guiding her with precision, telling her what to do, how to act. Ayumi began to notice things, small details, hidden beneath the surface of her life. The way her classmates laughed too loud, as if they were trying to drown out something they didn't want to face. The way her neighbors pretended to be happy, their voices thin and fake as they tried to cover up the loneliness that echoed through the walls. They were all the same, all of them pretending to be something they weren't, hiding behind their masks. And Ayumi realized that she didn't need a mask. She could. It was in those moments of clarity that Ayumi understood the truth. She was different. She was not like them, not like the people who had failed her, who had ignored her and pushed her aside. The world owed her something, and she would take it. No longer would she remain in the shadows, unnoticed and ignored. She had been chosen for something far greater than what the world had allowed her to be. The whispers became more than just a voice in her head. They became a command, an unshakable truth. Ayumi wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was a force, untouchable, unbreakable. The world around her began to shift. Her classmates, her neighbors, even her family. They were all just pieces on a chessboard, and Ayumi was the one who would move them. She didn't need anyone's permission. The more she allowed the whispers to guide her, the more she realized the power she held, the power that had been buried deep within her all this time. Ayumi was no longer the quiet girl in the corner. She was the coward, pillar of the group. She was the one who would shape the world. The darkness that had always lurked beneath her skin now became her ally, her strength. And when the time came, Ayumi would rise from the depths of her isolation, not as a broken, neglected girl, but as something much more dangerous. Ayumi had always worn a mask. It was a thin veil, barely noticeable to the outside world, but it had kept her hidden for so long. To everyone who passed her in the hallways of school or in the crowded streets of Tokyo, she was nothing more than a shadow, quiet, unobtrusive, a mere flicker of movement among the hundreds of other faceless people. But she was different, a simmering storm waiting for a spark to set it off. And for years, the mask was the only thing that kept her from collapsing into the darkness that tugged at the edges of her mind. But the mask had started to crack. It began slowly, a faint tremor in her otherwise controlled existence. The whispers in her mind, once gentle and coaxing, got turned darker, more insistent, urging her to act, to stop pretending, to stop playing the role of the quiet, invisible girl. She had tried to ignore them, to bury the growing unrest deep inside her, but it was impossible. It was as though the mask she wore had become a cage, and she was suffocating beneath it. Aumi felt her grip on the thin thread of normalcy beginning to slip, and with every passing day, the pressure inside her built higher, like a dam ready to burst. The breaking point came one evening, as the evening train rumbled through the dark streets of Tokyo. Aumi was on her way home from school, the familiar, monotonous clatter of the train tracks soothing her as it always did. But something felt different that night. There was an edge to the air, a tension that hummed beneath the surface of the crowded car. She sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the blurred lights of the city. But her mind was elsewhere. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, the weight of the thoughts she could no longer ignore pressing down on her chest. As the train rattled along, Ayumi's thoughts drifted to the faces of her classmates. Their smiles, their laughter, their seemingly perfect lives. They were all so loud, so vibrant, so utterly alive, but none of it mattered. They were just distractions. The whispers in her head had long ago told her that those people, those faces, were beneath her. They were mere puppets, strung along by the invisible threads of society. She was the one who could see the truth, the one who could break free from the chains that bound everyone else. Then a noise broke her reverie. A sharp, mocking laugh from a group of her classmates standing nearby. They were loud, careless, oblivious to Ayumi's presence as always. One of them, a boy with a bright, arrogant smile, was the source of the laughter. He was joking about something, but Aumi didn't care enough to listen. It was just another empty sound like all the others. But as he laughed, his voice rose above the hum of the train, sharp and grating. His words weren't directed at her, but she felt them hit her nonetheless. He was talking about someone else, mocking someone else, but in that moment, it felt as though he was mocking her, mocking everything she had endured. Something inside Aumi snapped. For the first time in years, she looked up from the floor, her eyes meeting his. There was no hesitation, no fear, just a sudden, overwhelming surge of rage that seemed to flood her entire being. It wasn't just his words that had triggered her. It was everything. The years of being overlooked, of being invisible, of being nothing more than a face in the crowd. The mask she had so carefully crafted over the years, the facade that had kept her safe from the chaos in her mind, crumbled. It was gone, shattered in an instant. And in its place, something darker emerged. A part of her she had kept hidden, a part that had been growing stronger in the silence, waiting for this exact moment. Without thinking, Aumi stood up. The train continued its endless clatter. The world outside blurred by the motion, but inside her, everything had come to a sudden, quiet stillness. She took a step forward, her eyes fixed on the boy. Her breath was steady, controlled. She could hear the murmurs of her classmates, the sudden shift in their voices as they noticed her movement. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. She was no longer invisible. She was something else now. The boy stopped laughing when Aumi reached him, his eyes narrowing as he took in the expression on her face. His grin faltered, replaced by a brief flicker of confusion. Aumi stood inches away from him, her presence somehow making the air feel colder, heavier. The silence between them stretched, filled with an intensity that neither of them could deny. For a moment, Aumi saw something in his eyes, a flash of realization, like he understood, or perhaps feared, what was about to happen. But it was too late. In that moment, Aumi understood something as well. She understood that her whole life had been leading to this instant, this singular moment of power. The whispers were no longer voices in her head. They were a part of her, a surge of cold clarity that washed over her. They had told her to break free, to show them all who she truly was. They had been right. For so long, Aumi had hidden behind the mask of a timid, quiet girl, pretending to be the person everyone expected her to be. But that girl was gone now. The mask had shattered, and what remained was something far more dangerous. As the train pulled into the next station, Aumi stepped back, the moment passing as quickly as it had arrived. The boy, his face now pale with confusion, turned away, likely to forget the encounter as quickly as it had occurred. But Ayumi didn't forget. She would never forget. The train ride continued in its usual rhythm. But something had shifted in Ayumi. She could feel it deep in her chest, a pulse of something dark and raw that had been awakened. The world outside seemed to blur as her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't stop, ideas she couldn't ignore. The whispers were louder now, insistent, urging her forward. They told her that this was just the beginning, that the mask was gone, and now she could do whatever she wanted. When she stepped off the train and walked through the crowded streets of Tokyo, Ayumi no longer felt like an outsider. The mask was gone, and in its place she felt something far more real, a primal understanding of her own darkness. She could feel the eyes of the people around her, sensing that something had changed, something irreversible. But Ayumi didn't care. She was a force, one that had been lying dormant, waiting to be unleashed. The breaking of the mask had been inevitable. It was a moment that Ayumi had been building toward her whole life, the moment when she would finally step out of the shadows and into the world as her true self. And as she walked through the neon-lit streets, the city around her alive with its usual frenetic energy, Ayumi felt the cold stirrings of something darker and more thrilling than she had. The night had settled over Tokyo like a heavy, suffocating blanket, dark and thick with the weight of things unsaid. The city, so often alive with noise and movement, now hummed with an eerie stillness that seemed to crawl under the skin. Ayumi stood at her bedroom window, the city lights flickering far below like the dim, dying embers of a fire. The world outside was just as it always was, vibrant, buzzing, full of life. But inside her, a storm was building, and it had nowhere else to go but out. She could feel it, the pulse of anticipation, a throb in her chest that matched the rhythm of the blood in her veins. Tonight was the night. The whispers had been constant, growing stronger each day, filling the empty spaces in her mind with their urgent demands. She had always known that there would come a time when the mask, the pretense, would no longer be enough to contain what was stirring within her. That time had come. She had been preparing for this, feeding the darkness that had taken root in her soul. It had taken time, but now she understood it, understood the hunger, the coldness, the need for control. She fought her way out, filling the vacuum with rage regardless of experience. She had to keep going, but the longer she stayed inside the hotel, the bad it became. It was all she needed, and tonight, the world would finally witness her power. Ayumi had watched them, observed them all, her neighbors, her classmates, the people who had once mocked her, ignored her, treated her as though she were invisible. She had lived in the shadows, behind the walls of her own life, but they had never known her, never known what she was capable of. But tonight that would change. Tonight she would erase them. She would make them remember her, and they would never be able to forget. The clock on her wall ticked, each passing second echoing in the silence of her room. She could feel the tension building, the pull of inevitability wrapping around her like a coil, tightening and pulling her toward what she had to do. The plan had been simple, so simple it almost seemed laughable. There was no need for complexity, no need for careful calculation. She had lived in this building for years. She knew every corner, every creak in the floorboards, every unlocked door. The neighbors, too, had become predictable, like puppets in a play whose script was written long ago. They would never see her coming. Ayumi had left school early, telling her teachers she wasn't feeling well. She had made sure that the people in her building would be home, one by one. She'd tracked their schedules, listened for the faint sounds of their movements through the walls. The building itself had become a labyrinth of hidden opportunities, a place where she could move unseen, unheard, until the apartment complex was quiet tonight, the usual hum of city noise distant and muted. She had waited for the perfect moment, a time when the night was still young, when the city had not yet fully woken up to the horrors she was about to commit. Her mother, as always, was out late at work, lost in her own world. It made no difference, though. Ayumi had learned long ago that she could not rely on anyone, not even family. She was alone in this, and in that solitude, she found her strength. Her hands were steady as she tied her sneakers, the fabric of her black hoodie clinging to her as she pulled it over her head. The night would be hers. It was the final step, the moment of transformation. Aumi had become the hunter, and now she would hunt. The first door was easy to open. She knew exactly where the keys were hidden, and within seconds she was inside. The faint smell of incense lingered in the air, a sign that her first victim had tried to mask the emptiness of their life. Aumi moved swiftly, gliding through the apartment like a shadow. She didn't need to look at their faces anymore. She didn't need to hear their screams. This was her moment, her time to finally claim what was rightfully hers. The knife was cold in her hand, gleaming like a promise. With one swift motion, it was done. The blood was always the hardest part, not because it frightened her, but because it felt like the final confirmation that everything was real, that this horror was hers. And as the life drained from the body at her feet, Aumi felt something shift deep inside her. She was no longer the girl who had been invisible. She was the one who controlled the narrative now. Every life she took was a small victory, a step closer to the world bending to her will. The second apartment was similar. Another life, another face that didn't matter anymore. She moved from room to room with practiced ease, her footsteps soundless on the carpet, her movements calculated. It was almost like a game, a cruel game of hide and seek, except she was the one who was never hiding. She was the one seeking, and her targets had no chance. With each death, Aumi felt herself becoming something else, something darker. The whispers in her mind had ceased their soft, coaxing tones. Now they were silent, almost reverent. She no longer needed them. She was the one in control. She was the one making the decisions. The people in the building had never understood her. They had never seen the truth of what lay beneath her quiet exterior. But now they would. The final apartment was the hardest. It was where her last target lived, the one person she had saved for last, the one who had pushed her too far, who had mocked her, who had made her feel worthless. Aumi knew their schedule better than anyone else's, knew the exact time they would be in, alone in the quiet of their home. She had spent weeks planning this final moment. Tonight, it would all come to an end. The door opened with a gentle push, the quiet creak barely audible. This time, Aumi didn't rush. There was no need. She was in control. She could take her time. As she stepped into the room, she could feel the presence of her target before she even saw them, could feel the faint stirrings of their confusion, their unease. They had no idea who was in the room with them, no idea what was about to happen. The knife slid through the air like an extension of her will. It was clean, quick, precise, and just like that, the last one fell. The room fell silent, save for the soft, rhythmic breathing of the girl who had never been seen, never been heard, but who had become something else tonight, something impossible to ignore. She looked down at the bodies, each one a marker of her victory, each one a testament to the darkness that had taken root in her soul. The night was quiet now. The building, once alive with the sound of its residents, was still. There were no more footsteps in the hallways, no more muffled voices behind closed doors. Aumi stood alone, the blood on her hands a final symbol of her transformation. There was no regret, no hesitation, just a deep, quiet satisfaction. Tonight, Aumi Takahashi had broken free from the shadows. The world had finally seen her for what she truly was, and there was no going back. The morning after the night of blood and silence arrived with a strangely unsettling calm. Tokyo, as always, moved with a mechanical precision. The trains running, the streets filled with commuters, the city's pulse steady and unwavering. But beneath the surface, the atmosphere was thick with something else, something that no one could see, but everyone could feel. The first rays of sunlight filtered weakly through the windows of the apartment complex, casting long shadows over the blood-stained floors. Outside, the city remained unaware of the massacre that had unfolded just hours earlier. A city that had long ago learned to move on, to forget, to pretend that nothing ever happened. But the residents of the building would never be able to forget. The first body was found early in the morning, an elderly woman in her 60s who lived alone in apartment 3B. She had been the quiet type, never involved with anyone, keeping to herself for years. Her neighbors barely knew her name, but they would never forget her now. When the building's superintendent unlocked the door after receiving complaints of an unbearable smell coming from inside, the gruesome scene inside hit him like a blow to the chest. The body, crumpled on the floor, her once gentle face now contorted in a horrific grimace, eyes wide open, staring at something that only she had seen. Blood pooled beneath her, spreading like dark ink across the room. It was the first time in years that the superintendent had seen anything that stopped him in his tracks. The moment the police were called, an unspoken fear began to spread throughout the building. The bodies were piling up, one after another, like dominoes. By the time the authorities arrived, word had spread among the residents and panic settled in. The building, once an ordinary place filled with quiet lives, was now an eerie crime scene, its hallways and walls echoing with whispers of death. People moved quickly, doors were locked, and eyes darted nervously across the hallway, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. No one could quite place it, but they all felt it. The presence of something dark, something unspoken that hung in the air like an omen. The first responders found more bodies, 4 in total. Each was more horrific than the last, each showing signs of violent struggle. Blood splattered across walls, streaked across the floors, soaking into the carpets, pooling into every corner of the rooms. In apartment 5A, a young man in his 20s was found slumped over his desk, his face frozen in an expression of terror. The knife that had taken his life lay discarded beside him, as though it had been thrown aside in haste. In apartment 6B, a young woman lay on the floor of her living room, a single slash across her throat, the only mark left on her otherwise perfect appearance. Her arms, though lifeless, seemed almost poised, as if she had been caught in the final moment of a nightmare. It was the cleanest of all the killings, and yet it felt the most deliberate, like an artist leaving their signature behind. Like the police were quick to seal off the building, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. The investigation had begun. Detective Ishida, the lead investigator, arrived at the scene with a grim expression etched into his features. He had seen his share of grisly crimes over the years, but something about this felt different. The bodies were scattered across multiple apartments in the same complex, all in various stages of disarray. It wasn't random. It was calculated. There was no sign of forced entry in any of the apartments, no signs of robbery or theft. This was personal. This was someone who knew their victims, someone who had spent time watching them, learning their routines, and understanding their lives. As Ishida stepped into the building's lobby, he felt an overwhelming sense of unease settle over him. The walls were covered in fingerprints, smudges, traces of hurried movements. The air was thick with the stench of death, a smell that lingered, wrapping itself around every surface. The residents were too scared to speak, their eyes wide, their voices hushed as they watched from behind cracked doors. The building felt alive in a way it never had before. It felt as though the walls themselves were hiding something, something that wasn't ready to be revealed. Ishida knew he had to act quickly. The media would be on this soon, and when they arrived, the eyes of Tokyo would be on this building, on these bodies, on whoever was responsible for what was becoming the most horrific series of killings the city had ever seen. He began his investigation by speaking to the neighbors, those brave enough to come forward. Most of them had been in their apartments, too afraid to venture out. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to every corner of the room as if they feared the killer might still be nearby. There were whispers of strange noises, shuffling in the hallways, footsteps late at night, the sounds of doors opening and closing when no one was supposed to be there. It didn't make sense. If the killer was living among them, they would have to know who it was, wouldn't they? But no one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. It was as though the killer had become a ghost, moving undetected through the walls, slipping into their lives unnoticed, and slipping out again just as quietly. Ishida's eyes scanned the crowd of neighbors, searching for something, anything that might offer a clue. The people who had lived here for years were rattled, broken by the sudden violence that had erupted in their midst. They were all victims in some way, afraid to leave their homes, afraid to trust the others in the building. But there was one girl who caught his attention, Aumi Takahashi. She was a quiet one. He had seen her walking through the streets of the neighborhood before, always keeping to herself. She had the look of someone who didn't belong, someone who had always stayed on the edges, just out of reach. Her face was pale, her eyes downcast, but there was something about the way she held herself, something in the way her hands trembled ever so slightly as she clutched her bag to her chest. It wasn't much, but Ishida's instincts told him to keep an eye on her. The neighbors spoke of her too. They described Aumi as an outcast, a loner. She was never part of any groups, never seemed to make any real connections with anyone. She lived in her own world, a world that now seemed too dark for any of them to understand. But then, as he pressed them further, some of the neighbors began to speak about strange things, things they hadn't noticed before. How she had always seemed to be watching, how she had never quite fit in with the others, how, on the rare occasions she did speak, her words were empty, distant, how she never cried when things were supposed to make her cry. Something wasn't right with her, they all agreed. Ishida couldn't ignore the growing suspicion in his gut. The pattern of the killings, the silence of the building, the unspoken tension. It was all too perfect. It was as though the killer had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the right time to strike. And Aumi, with her empty, expressionless face, seemed like the most likely person to have set it all in motion. But there were no guarantees. The investigation was just beginning. And as Ishida stared down at the crime scene, at the blood and the brokenness, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker was lurking just beneath the surface. Something that no one was ready to see. The tension in the investigation had reached a fever pitch. Detective Ishida felt it crawling under his skin, the gnawing certainty that the case was closing in on something terrible, something he wasn't yet ready to confront. The small, seemingly insignificant pieces of evidence had started to form a picture that was too precise, too deliberate. The pattern of deaths, the eerily quiet nature of the killings, and now Ayumi's strange behavior, it all pointed in one direction. Yet something in the back of his mind warned him that the truth was far worse than he could imagine. Aumi had become a ghost in his investigation, slipping through his fingers each time he thought he was close. The deeper he dug, the more unsettling the details of her life became. The neighbors spoke of her with a mix of fear and pity, as if they had all witnessed something they couldn't put into words. She was an enigma, her demeanor cold and detached, her movements deliberate and controlled. But that it was the absence of emotion, the chilling void where a normal person's guilt or grief should have been. There was nothing in Ayumi's eyes, not remorse, not fear, only a disturbing emptiness. As the investigation dragged on, the pressure mounted. The killer had left no trace of themselves, no fingerprints, no witnesses, no break-in. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. And then, just as Ishida thought he had exhausted every lead, a break came in the form of a hidden diary. It wasn't much, just a small leather-bound book that Aumi had kept in a locked drawer. But it was enough to send a chill crawling up his spine. The diary was filled with her thoughts, her observations of the people in her building, her neighbors, their routines, their weaknesses. The words were meticulous, almost clinical, as though she had been studying them like specimens under a microscope. There was no trace of humanity in her writing, only cold, calculated notes. As he flipped through the pages, Ishida's eyes landed on one entry that sent a shiver down his spine. They don't understand. They never will. I've watched them all for so long. They don't deserve to live. The words hit him like a punch. It wasn't just a confession. It was a manifesto, a justification for the madness that had unfolded. Aumi had carefully selected each victim. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life, learning their habits, their fears, waiting for the perfect time to strike. The killings had been planned, methodical, and it was all driven by something far darker than mere revenge. It was a twisted need for control, for power, for recognition. As Ishida read on, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The last entry was brief, but devastating. Tonight, I will make them see me. They will remember my name. I will be the one they can't forget. The finality of it all hit Ishida like a wave. Aumi had been hunting them, waiting, and now the truth was undeniable. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was the result of a mind twisted by years of isolation, a girl who had been consumed by the need to be noticed, to be remembered, and now there was no escaping what she had done. He set the diary down with trembling hands. There was no longer any doubt. Aumi was the killer, and the horror of what she had become was far worse than he had ever imagined. The investigation was over, but the terror had only just begun.